Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Sonia Sodha, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and also Tom Newton Dunn, the chief political commentator with Times Radio. Tomorrow's front pages. Let's start with the front page of the Metro. It looks at the row over lobbying of politicians involving the collapsed firm Greensill Capital. The Metro echoes the words of the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who accused ministers of a return to Tory sleaze. In the wake of the Greensill row, the Telegraph focuses on the crackdown on senior civil servants who have been asked to declare any paid second jobs by the end of this week. Meanwhile, as the Treasury Select Committee looks into lobbying, the Eyes headline is UK lobbying watchdog is lobbyist. Away from Greensill, The Guardian reports that the issuing of COVID passports could amount to unlawful indirect discrimination, according to the government's independent equalities watchdog. The Daily Mail features a newly released picture of the Queen and the late Duke of Edinburgh with their great-grandchildren. And those are the papers. Let's start with a word I don't think I've heard since 1997. Sonia Sodha, sleaze is back, according to the Metro.
Yes, that's right. So the story about Greensill and David Cameron's role in lobbying on their behalf, his sort of former friends and colleagues in government, is rumbling on. And actually, the longer this story goes on, the more it is actually sort of reaching beyond the direct question of David Cameron and what he asked for and may or may not have got for this company. Greensill, to whom he was acting as an advisor, stood to gain a lot directly if the company did well. But the story is moving beyond the question of that direct relationship, as important as that is, to the question of other relationships, other ministers who may be involved, but also the question of very, very senior civil servants. And we're talking about some of the most senior civil servants in the civil service. We've got the Telegraph reporting that some very senior civil servants themselves may have also been involved in doing paid work for companies, advisory work, while they're working for the civil service. And this seems like such an extraordinary conflict of interest. You just wouldn't expect, if you're a civil servant, a senior civil servant working on kind of business related, you would expect that you are working only in the service of the government and the public interest. But it turns out, first of all, through this Greensill story, we know that the former head of procurement for the government had a spell where he was working in a senior role both for the Cabinet Office and as a paid advisor to Greensill at the same time. And it seems that other senior civil servants may have similar conflicts of interest. So there are huge questions developing over this that don't just relate to David Cameron, the role of a former Prime Minister in lobbying, but also other ministers to civil servants. And, you know, it really has been the big political story of the day, with Labour calling for a much more independent, wider-ranging inquiry than the government have committed to.
And they didn't get it in Parliament. You mentioned the Telegraph. Let's show the audience the Telegraph. On the front page, in the centre there, crackdown on Mandarin's second jobs. Tom Newton Dunn from Times Radio. I think a lot of people were surprised that senior civil servants, I don't know how many of them, had second jobs anyway. Are they allowed to?
Well, if you believe the Cabinet Office, who wrote back to the chairman of ACOBA, the appointments committee that's supposed to sign these things off, one Lord Pickles, a former Cabinet Minister himself, then yes, although that was to the distinct surprise of everybody, including every watching journalist and quite a lot of government ministers, and I think 10 Downing Street as well, and also of some surprise to Simon Case, who's the Cabinet Secretary featured on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, who has written to every single permanent secretary in Whitehall after I hear having a meeting with them all this morning was fairly testy, saying we now need to get to the bottom of exactly who has these second jobs, who is effectively on double bubble, who is being remunerated by some private company in the big white word of commercialness, at the same time as working for the British taxpayer.
They don't know this? And, do they not know this?
No, they don't. I think, no, and this is the heart of the whole problem. It may be, this of course comes from a chap called Bill Crothers, who was the chief commercial officer for the Cameron government back in 2014, 2015. He then went to work for Greensill Capital. And why we're talking about this now is because he was working for both at the same time. He was allowed to do a job share for a few months, which staggered everybody. That was this morning's front page stories. And now we're moving on to the next day, which is this desperate panic really across Whitehall, trying to find out who else has had one of these job shares. It may be not many, or it may be quite a lot. And the real problem for Downing Street and for Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary now, all these people charged trying to get to the bottom and then clean all this mess up, is they just don't know. They simply don't know at the moment the scale of the problem, which means, obviously, it's a very hard one to fix.
I'm not, Sonia Sodha, an expert at interpreting Mandarin's letters, but even I saw that letter from Simon Case thinking, right, there's an awful lot between the lines of this.
Absolutely, and I think it kind of raised as many questions as it answered, that letter. And I think the sort of bigger question from all of this is that if this has been allowed to go on, and as Tom says, we don't know quite yet how far it goes, which is why I think Labour are right to be asking for an independent inquiry that goes further than just the Greensill David Cameron question. But what, you know, if this has been allowed to go on, what kind of rule changes do we need? What's gone wrong in the processes? Because obviously, a priori, it just is so blatantly wrong that you can draw a salary working in a very senior government role and at the same time get paid again for advising a company that stands to benefit from government contracts. I mean, that is just such a major conflict of interest. And it's extraordinary, really, that we know, at least in 2 or 3 cases, that this has been going on. So I think the real question is, how do we resolve this? It's very clear that the system, systems to try and prevent lobbying, try and prevent the revolving door whereby which ministers and senior civil servants go and work for companies and lobby their sort of former mates in government. I mean, now we know some of them are actually holding jobs for private companies at the same time as working in government. Very, very clear that the system is broken and needs fixing. And I think that is really where we need to establish how far this goes and what changes we need to the system to make sure that we don't see these very serious conflicts of interest again.
We're going to stay with the Telegraph when we look at the next story. On the front page, next to a picture of the Queen and the late Duke of Edinburgh, I think in 2018 with their great-grandchildren, is a story about the upcoming funeral. Funerals, of course, for whatever family Tom Newton Dunn, are sometimes complicated. Everyone comes together for one moment, bringing whatever prior problems they might have had to a single family gathering. The story, Duke's expected to wear civilian dress after uniform row.
Yeah, you need to unpack this one a little bit. You're right, funerals are complicated, often quite emotional experiences for everybody as well, not just because you're mourning the person who's died and you're burying Prince William's funeral, obviously, on Saturday, and 30 members of the royal family are allowed to attend. Not many funerals, however, get caught up in a big old controversy beforehand about the dress sense. That's normally pretty straightforward for people. If you're the royal family, of course, everything is complicated. And this, I think, started with Prince Harry, who's come back from the United States, from California, is currently quarantining, so he can be free to go to the funeral and pass the COVID rules on Saturday. He is not allowed to go to the funeral in military dress because he's no longer a working royal. The Queen stripped him of his military responsibilities and his uniforms. He has no ceremonial ranks anywhere anymore. So he was facing the prospect of having to walk behind his grandfather's coffin, that quite emotional walk from one part of Windsor Castle to St George's Chapel, as the only member of the family in a suit or a morning coat or something. Then along came Prince Andrew. Now, he wanted to dress in an admiral's uniform. Apparently, he thinks he's entitled to wear the uniform of admiral. He was in the Royal Navy, never quite made it that high. And that caused some controversy. The Queen was reported today not so happy about him playing admiral, and also perhaps not wanting to embarrass Prince Harry. So she said it would appear, it's been reported tomorrow, right, that's it, everybody's in civilian clothing. We're not going to have any more arguments about who wants to dress up as what, and you're all going to wear a suit. That basically is the nutshell of the story. If you think your family is complicated, you ain't seen nothing until you've seen this one.
Talking about military dress and military uniforms really leads us on to the next paper, The Guardian, which was about people who were in uniform for 20 years in Afghanistan and who are now leaving. On the front page, Biden ends longest war with troop exits. That's, Sonia Sodha from The Observer, is the quote from Biden, longest war. It's also been called forever war, sometimes the forgotten war. How would you sum it up?
Well, certainly very long. And this isn't sort of, I suppose, a great surprise to close watchers of Biden's foreign policy and foreign policy statements over kind of recent months and years. It's probably one of the few things he shares in common in terms of policy positions with Donald Trump. He kind of always made it clear that he was going to, at some point soon, withdraw US troops from Afghanistan. He's going to do that by September, we now know. I think the really serious question this raises is, the US has had an important, played a big role in Afghanistan, I suppose, over the last kind of 2 decades, but it really hasn't made things better through its intervention, and some people would argue that it's made things worse. And Afghanistan isn't really in a much better place than it's been of late, and there are lots of concerns about what's going to happen when the US and indeed other countries withdraw their kind of international presence. Lots of fears, from people living in Afghanistan, particularly women, about the return of the Taliban and what that could mean for them. And I think you just have to look at it and just see, I mean, it's just such an American and international, really, foreign policy failure. There was just no plan. And, I think the worst aspect about this is what this means to the people of Afghanistan going forwards. I mean, the international community has had no solutions for them, no kind of constructive solutions. And I think it's really the people of Afghanistan that we have to feel like really sorry for in all of this.
Tom Newton Dunn from Times Radio. When Joe Biden first came to public office, the United States was propping up a government in Asia against seen as a guerrilla enemy. The United States left, that guerrilla enemy took over. Is South Vietnam, Afghanistan, is that the same story now?
Well, there are interesting parallels, of course. I mean, they're fundamentally different conflicts. America was just beaten in Vietnam and had to leave, having been soundly militarily defeated and lost 50, 60,000 troops dead. Different case in Afghanistan, not as many dead, and the victory or loss is not quite as clear, although obviously it's not going particularly well. The Taliban resurging. You just had a very good report on the 10 o'clock news there about that. But I agree with Sonia on this. What is effectively happening in Afghanistan is the West has just run out of patience. And you're right, we've been there for a long time, 20 years, in fact. 20 years come the 11th of September, this September, when Joe Biden wants to pull all his troops out, that 20-year anniversary being very poignant of 9/11. But there is no other reason for it, apart from the fact that someone's decided that that's it and we don't want to be there any longer. And I also, I think I was a defense correspondent before I was a political journalist. I covered Afghanistan for years, went to and from there repeatedly, and it was clear it was going to be a long haul. And the interesting thing that the generals used to say to us at the time is that what the Taliban, they would hear back from them, which is an old Afghan expression, you've got the watches, we've got the time. We just need to keep on shooting you. Eventually you're going to leave because you haven't got the patience for this anymore. And rebuilding a country, defeating an entire ideology, if you like, was really a very, very long game indeed, which the West just simply had to be prepared to play for the long term, and it turns out it isn't.
Let's stay with The Guardian on the front page. Watchdog warns requirement for COVID passports may be unlawful. Sonia Sodha, is this then a problem for the government if the government wants this strategy?
I think the answer is it could be. So what it sounds like the EHRC have said from this story is that there are certain circumstances which requiring COVID passports and sort of evidence of vaccination could stray into the territory of breaking equalities law. And the sort of specific, the specific examples that are mentioned in the story are, for example, if you had an industry that required or COVID passports or to work in it when young people haven't even been offered their jab yet, that would obviously put young people at a disadvantage in the labour market, for example. So that's one of the examples that's given. And I do think this comes at an important time because obviously it's something that the government is clearly considering. Boris Johnson has asked people to do work on. It does sort of raise the question, though. I think there are two questions about COVID passports. There is this, obviously, this kind of sort of equality issue, but I think they probably could be implemented in a way that was consistent with equalities legislation. But this is quite complicated technologically. Is this really where the government should be focused? given that in sort of 3 or 4 months, hopefully, we hope that the whole population will have had their first jab and will have quite a good degree of immunity. I would actually argue that where the government needs to be focusing is probably, as well as getting the vaccines out as quickly as possible, we know take-up is good, which is great, is also thinking about the kind of summer holidays policy, because I actually think that the real risk to us as a country in terms of a third wave could come from a variant coming in that is more vaccine resistant than some of the variants that we've seen develop to date. So I'm not sure it's the best focus for government attention at the moment.
One focus, if we look at our final paper, the Financial Times, on the front page, you'll see a ship, which we all know the name of that one. There it is, the Evergreen. It has not got to its destination. Those exercise bikes, those fridges, refrigerators, washing machines are still locked on them. Tom Newton Dunn, why is that?
PlayStation 5s, bicycles, a couple of things. I'm trying to get my hands on PlayStation 5. My son, I should point out, for months. It might well be in those crates that aren't going to get open anytime soon. The reason being, I mean, you have to feel the pain of the Ever Given, don't you, and the captain there. The reason being is that there's now a monumental row going on of who pays for all the damage and the cleanup operation that the Ever Given caused when it crashed into the side of the Suez Canal. So Suez authorities have impounded the ship to say to its Japanese owners, you ain't getting it back, and I'm not getting my PlayStation, you're not getting your bicycle, until someone pays up to the tune of some $900 million. That was the cost, I think, all the delays and also the rescue operation, the ships and the digging, everything that was caused by that long delay of a week or so, a few weeks back until, of course, it was free. So, yes, it stays in the Suez, at the top of the Suez anyway, not going anywhere anytime soon. And actually, this is just the latest in a long series of backlogs, largely COVID-based, a little bit Brexit-based as well, stopping goods arriving not just in the UK ports or around Europe, and unfortunately, it's going to go on.
Sonia Sodha, in a sentence, a second canal, would that make things easier?
I think that might be a bit more than 900 million.
Right, it would. Sonia Sodha, Tom Newton Dunn, I'll see you both in a little bit. Thank you. That's it for the papers for now. Sonia and Tom will be back in about 40 odd minutes time to look at more of the stories being covered by newspapers and websites. Goodbye for now.